So today we're into Chapter 7, Section 2, which is really about trade along the Silk Roads and in the Indian Ocean, but also religion and a little bit of culture. So really three elements. Number one, trade. Number two, culture. And then number three, part of culture, which is the spread of religious practices throughout India and the surrounding regions. Roman numeral 1 talks about how Buddhism and Hinduism, which are very popular in India at the time, sort of adapt and change. And capital A says traditional Hindu and Buddhist beliefs. First of all, Hinduism sort of blends some of the old Aryan beliefs and other belief systems. You got to remember that Hindu involves a belief in many gods, so it's a polytheistic faith. To Buddhists, on the other hand, they believe that desires cause suffering, but they also believe that suffering can be overcome. Buddhism is a little bit different in the ideology of who do you worship. It's really something very different. We'll talk about the different sects of Buddhism that came about. So that's capital letter B. Point number 1 is that the belief in bodhisattvas develops as potential Buddhas who can save humanity. There's two big sects that come out of this. The Mahayana sector, you could say. These Buddhists accepted new doctrines of worship and belief in salvation or forgiveness. And then you had the Theravada sect. These Buddhists are sort of your more original followers of the true Buddhist faith. So like old school versus new school here we're talking about. Wealthy Buddhist merchants began to build these stone structures called stupas over old religious relics. So they became sort of a pilgrimage site where people would come and visit and worship. And then capital letter C is going to talk about how Hinduism sort of evolved. Hinduism is remote. It's kind of moving from place to place. By the time of the Mauryan Empire, it started to move toward monotheism. Gods were part of one major divine force. Now, there were some chief gods, though, in the Hinduism of this time period. Brahma was the creator of the world, Vishnu was the preserver of the world, and Shiva was the destroyer of the world. Because this is a world history class, I'm just giving you the very basics. I did assign the reading, so hopefully you're getting a little bit more from that reading. And in your textbook, there are a lot of charts and graphs that talk about a lot of these things in more depth. Roman numeral 2 says the achievements of Indian culture. Capital A says literature and the performing arts. One key figure was Kalidasa. He was a poet and dramatist, one of India's greatest writers. His skillful and emotional stirring plays were still very popular today in Bollywood films. There was a city called Madurai, which was in southern India, and there were writing academies established there that created literature. And about 2,000 Tamil poems survive from some of these academies today. You also had drama and dance troupes beginning to gain popularity and travel widely. Today, one of the popular forms of dance is Bollywood style, and that's sort of what originates during this time period here in India, and especially in the southern Indian region, which at that time was known as the Tamil region. Capital B, we'll talk briefly about astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Ocean trade by way of the Indian Ocean led to advancements in astronomy. Early on, before you utilize different instruments, most of these early traders would definitely utilize the stars and things of that nature to guide them throughout the nights. Point number 3 talks about mathematics. In India, they did develop the idea of zero, and they also came up with a decimal system. These are actually two really important parts of math. A lot of different groups didn't have the concept of zero. Like in Rome, they did not have the concept of zero. The Mayans, who we'll learn about later, did have the concept of zero. So strong mathematical regions definitely had this concept, whereas others didn't. Number 4, medical doctors began to write guides and make advances in surgical procedures during this time as well. And so we'll move on into Roman numeral 3, which will talk about the spread of Indian trade. Here's some of the things that India had to offer to the rest of the world. Number 1, spices. We know that the spices were very important for the ideology of food. Most food was really bland during this time, so spices could make that food taste better. Diamonds were available in India. We know that that's a very precious stone. Other precious stones and good quality wood from timber and forests in different regions of India could also be found and were valuable resources for trade. Now, part of the things that we'll talk about here, the two different types of trade, by land and by sea. Point number one is going to talk about those famous trade routes called the Silk Roads, which connected Asia and Europe. Really, these Silk Roads are just pathways and things of that nature that allowed people to travel safely from place to place to trade these goods. Indians would build trading posts along the sides of those roads and along those what you could call pathways to take advantage of the trade that's going back and forth. Next is capital C. Talk about sea trade, east and west. Indian merchants would carry goods to the regions of Rome by sea. We're talking Mediterranean region. When we say Rome, we mean, North Africa, part of the Middle East, the Byzantine Empire region as well, which was kind of like modern day Turkey. That's basically what we're talking about at this time. Merchants would also trade by sea with, of course, Africa, as I mentioned, Arabia, China, which is just to the north, and then also Southeast Asia, which is full of many different islands that you could only access by way of the sea. Some of the effects of this increase in trade would mean that there was a rise in what was called banking. We had banks where people could store money. Really, the concept of interest wasn't too far away. The system of writing a check was part of this process as well. Bankers would lend money to merchants, and they would sort of take a careful look at the degree of risk in what they were putting their money into, and the type of interest rates that they would give depended on the risk level of what their investment was. Very similar to what goes on today with banks. Increased trade, though, would also spread Indian culture to other places. This is a concept that we've learned about throughout the year, which would involve, of course, cultural diffusion. And then we have trade bringing Hinduism and Buddhism to other lands. And so I'd like to take you to just a few pictures from the textbook here that sort of exemplify this information. Here's the Gupta Empire. Here's the Tamil region down here. So in this map, you can see some of the key goods that we talked about. And then these are the Silk Roads. All of these major red pathways are the trade routes that people from China, people from India, people from Southeast Asia would travel along to get goods coming from Arabia, the kingdom of Aksum, which we learned about in chapter 4. This is Rome over in this area. This is the Byzantine Empire here. This is Persia. And of course, China. So these are some of the major trade routes. This is Indian Ocean trade down in this region here. And you can see that the Arabian Sea is also a major trade route here. So this type of trade is really expanded upon during this time period around 400 to 500, 600 AD. All of these items that are the items that are traded: cloth, grains, ivory, metals, precious stones like diamonds, silk, which originates in China, and China sort of had a monopoly on that. Slaves. Anytime you see a blue individual, these are slaves that are being traded from these regions to other places. So you can see that the Arabians, the Persians sort of participated in that. The Aksumites here, and also in India, they did trade slaves, and other places as well. Spices, obviously a big one coming from India. Timber, a big one coming from India. The tortoise shell, that's one coming from the Arabia, from Africa, and also from southern India. Tortoise shell has a couple of functions. I mean, it's a pretty durable substance, but also there were certain types of musical instruments that were played from the tortoise shell. Now, if you come down here, you'll see a map of the spread of Buddhism. Obviously, you see India, number one, and then going to China, going down into the regions of Southeast Asia, and then, of course, into southern India, and then elsewhere from there. Okay, that is the basis of section number 2 for chapter 7. There's only one section left, which is section 3, which returns to studying China under the Han Dynasty.